Welcome to the opening session of Parenting in the Pandemic, Piecing It Together. One of the many disruptions COVID-19 has brought to our lives is the shift within the home and the shift to the home. And these intense conditions combined with the uncertainties of COVID-19 make it tough for families to keep a sense of calm. You know what I'm talking about. So this is why we brought two internationally acclaimed experts to help us navigate through this transition. Dan Ariely is a James B. Duke professor of behavioral economics at Duke University. He dedicates his life to study human behavior, specifically the irrational, and he finds ways to help us do better. He's also the author of several award-winning books, including Predictably Irrational, The Hidden Forces That Shape Our Decisions, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, How We Lie to Everyone, Especially Ourselves, and many more. Dr. Tal Ben-Shahar is an author and lecturer. He taught two of the largest classes in Harvard University's history, positive psychology, and the psychology of leadership. Today, Tal consults and lectures around the world on topics including leadership, happiness, education, innovation, ethics, resilience, self-esteem, mindfulness, and more. Tal is also a serial entrepreneur and an avid sportsman. All right, Tal, let's start with you. What can you tell us about our current state of happiness? And what are some of the mechanisms being used already to deal with the uncertainty of the current climate?
Yeah, one of my Israeli friends recently said to me, Tal, shouldn't we quarantine happiness for a while? And I think this is the sentiment that's quite pervasive now. Let's put it on hold and come back to it when things go back to normal, whatever that means. The thing, though, is that when it comes to the science of happiness, there are many tools and techniques that we can use today to help us deal with difficulties and hardships. In other words, the field is not just for good times. It's also when things are rough, when there is uncertainty. And the basic idea here is to go back to basics. So if physical exercise is important during regular times, it's even more important now. If spending quality time with people we care about, whether it's really or virtually, then we need to do it even more now. If gratitude is important during normal days, it is even more important now to find something that we can be grateful for. So go back to basics even more.
It's so funny you say that because a friend of mine just yesterday told me, someone asked her if she's happy right now. She said, happy wouldn't exactly be the term I use. And she also said, maybe it's time to put it on hold and focus on gratitude. Dan, do you agree? Is this like something we should still work to have, or maybe we should put happiness or that expectation for happiness on hold?
So first of all, I don't think it's a good idea to put good things on hold. We already have to put too many good things on hold, like planning. So the things we have control over, we should work on. And yes, maybe it's not ideal to strive to ultimate happiness right now. There's lots of restrictions, but for improvements, I think the answer is yes. And going back to Tal's comment, he said if gratitude is important. Every time he said if, it doesn't mean if. He means it is important. It's even more important now. And I think the issue is really lack of control. If you think about one of the mechanisms that give us resilience is control. And when control is taken away from us, we want revenge, we get angry, we get frustrated. And COVID-19 is full of lack of control for us. I'm in Israel, somebody decided no school, somebody decided you can run, but you can't walk, you can you can't go into the water, but you can be on the beach. I mean, the lack of control we all have on our lives is incredible. And one of the things that is incredibly important for happiness is to feel in control. Now, how can we feel in control? So Tal mentioned exercise. Exercise is good for lots of things, but I would pick an exercise that gives you a feeling of control. So for example, walking doesn't give you an extra sense of control. But if you start doing a plank, you can see your improvement, right? You can see how you're getting better. So I would pick the kind of things that give us some control. Reading before bed, taking habits that we can see that we can improve on. I think control can include things like starting a new habit, getting to be steady in something we had a hard time on. So I think all of those things are important. Because so much control was taken away from us, I would fight back, trying to get as much of it as possible. And then the other thing, and when COVID period started, I came to Israel to help, and I studied lots of things that are happening in the public sector and what we can do to help. And of course, one of the things we found was a dramatic increase in domestic violence, both against women and particularly against kids. And domestic violence is one of those things that you only need to put people together and add some stress, and you get an increase in domestic violence. There was a study that looked at the US and asked the question of what are the days of the year that has the most reports of domestic violence. It was basically Valentine's Day. It was actually every time you put people together, but Valentine's Day was the highest. And the secret to anger is that you put people together with high expectations, and bad things happen. And COVID-19 is tough. We have people together often in close proximity and no ability to do much. And the trick they often tell people who have anger that bursts into violence is, if you feel anger bursting, leave the home. And of course, now we can't leave. So we have this tremendous challenge. And one of the sad things we've discovered about violence, especially against kids, is that, of course, it's terrible to have violence, but they also need to feel control, and they also need to feel that there's somebody else who loves them. That gives a tremendous resilience, feeling that you're not alone in the world, feeling that somebody else loves you, that you have some control over your environment is incredibly important. So my second part of this, you said, do we need happiness? I also think we need to also figure out how to deal with the extreme low level, the anti-happiness, the misery that comes. How do we deal with our own frustration and anger and stress? How do we not get it on other people? How do we show kids and everybody else love, affection? But the feeling of control seems to be running across the board with all of those.
Thank you. Tal, what do you think? I mean, this is definitely a period of uncertainty. What would you, suggest in order for people to take hold of that control? And I mean, back to happiness. Can we really be happy even during a pandemic?
Yeah, I think one of the points that Dan made, which is very important for these times, is the idea of expectations. When I started off in this field of happiness studies 30 years ago or so, I thought that high expectations, was a prerequisite for success and happiness. And basically, I advocated in my classes and drawing on research, whether it's on expectations from children, expectations from ourselves, expectations from our colleagues, and so on. Today, I see it differently. So expectations when it comes to success are important. We know that hope is important. We know that expectations of students is important, of ourselves. But when it comes to happiness, there's a more nuanced answer to the question of expectations. I'll give you an example. So if my expectation is to go into the COVID-19 period, this uncertainty, and be happy all the time, these are false expectations, and I'm bound to experience frustration as a result. Dan gave the example of Valentine's Day. If my expectation is that during Valentine's Day, we'll be together and happier than we'd ever been before, more in love than we'd ever been before, then my expectations are likely to be frustrated. More generally, if I go into a relationship and think the honeymoon phase will last for the next 50 to 75 years, these are false expectations that lead to unhappiness. So lowering expectations to the point of having realistic expectations. Now, what are realistic expectations? Well, we'll experience ups and downs throughout our lives. And what we need to do is give ourselves the permission to be human. the permission to experience these ups and downs. Lower realistic expectations in a relationship means that we'll have good times and difficult times, even in the best of relationships. That's realistic. Realistic expectations is during COVID-19, the uncertainty will lead to anxiety, the being together in the same, in lockdown will lead to frustration. These are all natural human experiences. And if our expectation is that we'll have these experiences, we're much better off. And we won't feel, as Dan said, out of control.
My ex-wife used to say that I do best in scenarios with low expectations. But I guess she didn't have low enough expectations.
And well, she's still being quoted, so she must have done something right, left an impression there. Dan, you were quoted in late April saying the magnitude of the problem is tremendous. The barriers that are standing in our way are amazing. This is going to be a very tough period. What have we learned since then?
So we haven't learned much about the virus, which is kind of shocking. If you think about what progress have we made in terms of understanding it, it's been, we've learned some things, but not a lot. And we've learned that everything we've said about social science is correct, even more so. So we've learned a lot about the importance of social goods, on the kind of things we could do together. We learned a lot about the erosion of trust. We learned a lot about what's happening with people who believe in conspiracy theories. And we've also learned, if we are thinking about education, of how much the model of one teacher standing in front of 30 kids, how much this model is not working. And I remember when I was in first grade, I think they told me, "Oh, this is first grade. This is how it look. You're going to be 40 kids in the classroom, and there'll be a teacher, but you'll see that soon this will be gone." And of course, it hasn't gone anywhere until now. And I think from an educational perspective, as long as we had a teacher standing in front of the kids, and the teacher could force kids to pay attention from time to time, there was not a need to change anything. However, comes COVID-19, and all of a sudden a teacher is teaching 40 kids or 30 kids over Zoom, and the kids can turn it off, right? And then you can't force them to do anything, and they can mute the teacher, and all of a sudden the power game is very different, right? And what we see is a really, really complex picture. So we have been studying kind of what is happening in online education. And what we saw is that there were some places where kids were learning tremendously more than they were learning in school, but there were very few, and most of the places the online education was not working so well. And the kids that were excelling were doing one of two things. They were either kids who were introverts or usually not feel free to talk in class, and all of a sudden the digital communication tools allowed them to do that. That was some improvement, but the dramatic improvement were the kids who decided not to study anything that the education system told them to study. So I'll give an example from Israel. If you take a group of kids and you tell them to study Bible study, chapter 5 of Yeshayahu Bet, the kids are unlikely to want to study that. But if you allow the kids to choose what they were going to study, and this happens when the kids want to do it, the parents want to do it, the teachers want to do it, the principals, the stars have to align, education was just blossoming, right? And we kind of always knew that autonomy is important and following what your heart and your interest and so on. COVID-19 basically bifurcated the kids. There were some kids who were still in the old model of classroom just over some digital technology, and learning is not very effective in that world. On the other hand, we have the sadly few kids who basically had the privilege of getting their parents and teachers and principals to allow them to not care, not to say something, not to care about what the education system wants from them. And You see kids that are learning Python and kids that are writing books and doing their own projects on geography and all kinds of things. But it's a time when we need to say, usually, I'll take a step back. Usually we have a lot of physical control over our environment. Even if you're an adult and you go to work, there's the work environment. You can't look at Facebook all day long. You have meetings and people look at your screens. There are lots of things in the environment that gets us to work, get us to accomplish our long-term goals, even if they're not that desirable for us right now. And school, of course, is full of those. The moment people are at home, we are much, much more dependent on intrinsic motivation. And one way to go about it is to say, let's just get people to have more intrinsic motivation. That's nicely said, but very unlikely to work. The second thing is to say, let's switch what people are doing to the extent that we can, so that we tap into the highest level of intrinsic motivation that we can. And a little harder at work, a little easier with kids, but that I think is the key. And we're learning that every place that this has been gone on, it's been tremendously successful.
Touching upon your first points about choosing something that the student wants to learn, I mean, it seems that the system needs to adapt, and maybe this is even relevant before COVID. Todd, what do you think is important to keep in mind as a parent, with the current obstacles in place?
Yeah, I think, again, these are different times. And one of my mentors, Professor Richard Hackman, used to say, time for change, whether organizationally or personally, is when all the balls are up in the air. Well, right now, all the balls are up in the air. It's time for change, which we can, of course, maximize and make the best of. How do we do that? So building on what Dan said, I want to go back to the early 1970s. So in the field of organizational behavior, which is my field, something very important happened, which was the work of Robert Greenleaf. Robert Greenleaf looked for what defines extraordinary leaders. And he identified that what defines extraordinary leaders is what he has come to call servant leadership. He realized that all the great leaders throughout history had that common characteristic. For example, he started with Moses. When did God choose Moses? When he realized that he was serving the flock and he said, well, he can serve my people. He gives the example of Jesus as a leader servant. Fast forwarding to the 20th century, Gandhi saw himself as the servant of the people of India. And Nelson Mandela, after
Bibi Netanyahu, obviously.
27, well, that's a longer conversation, which I'm happy to have.
But you're talking about how the person perceives himself as
perceives himself and acts, not just perceives himself. The two have to go together. There has to be integrity between espoused theory and theory in use. But let me go back to Mandela. He came back out of prison, 27 years, not seen by the rest of the world. One of the first interview that he gave, addressing the people of South Africa, he said, "I am your servant." Servant leadership you see also with Jack Welch, who not everybody loved, but he certainly saw himself as serving his managers, his people. Anita Roddick, founder of The Body Shop, same thing. And what they essentially do is they take the organizational chart where you usually have the CEO, the managers, the middle managers, and the line employees, and they flip it upside down. So this is servant leadership. Now, interestingly, the most important characteristic that Robert Greenleaf identified, and later researchers identified about servant leaders, is listening. The number one characteristic, listening. And this is important for extraordinary leaders in extraordinary times. We are in extraordinary times, what we need more than anything. And when I talk about leadership, I mean in organizations, I mean national leadership. I also mean leadership in the classroom or in the home. And Dan's point about intrinsic motivation, let's listen to what our students want and need. Let's listen to what our teachers want and need. You know, it's no coincidence that Moses, the first servant leader that at the very least Robert Greenleaf pointed to, he stuttered, kvad peu kvad lashon. God didn't look for someone who was extremely charismatic and could give arousing speeches. He looked for someone who could listen well. And I think today, this is exactly what we need to look for, whether it's in our system of education, whether it's in our homes, and also in terms of partnership. For my wife, my husband, my partner, we need to listen first.
Listen first. I can definitely do more of that.
I would be a little bit less generous with this. I think what we need is a bit more civic disobedience. And what I mean is, I think that, for example, as parents, I think it's time to understand that, yes, the school system might want kids to do A, B, and C, but this doesn't make sense for my own kid right now. So we'll figure out what to replace A and B with. You know, the system by itself does the things that optimize for the whole system. In the US, for example, we had this No Child Left Behind policy, which had a very specific optimization of what the system was going to do. And now the system is, in a distance learning, is working far from desirable. And I think parents need to take more control. The idea that somebody else would educate our kids for us and somebody else has the tools to do it right now, it's just not in the cards. And if we just accept what is given to us in this suboptimal way, it's not ideal. So, you know, if you're a parent and you look at what the education system is giving you and you're very happy with it, fine, that's great. But if you see places where this is not ideal for your kid and there's something else that needs to happen, I think we need to step forward. It's you know, it's very hard to think that an education system that was designed for a long time for this very different kind of teaching would basically be able to adapt and do its role. Right now, we just need to understand that and need to take a bit more control ourselves, and the parents need to do it.
All right, we have time for one more question. So, you know, we have an audience of parents who are really looking to you for advice, especially now with going back to school. Let's talk about resilience, what we can do to build and preserve it. And also, I'm curious, what makes both of you happy? Tal, let's start with you.
Let me start with the second question. Well, what makes me happy is spending quality time with my family. What makes me happy is also spending time alone, where I can just journal or shed a tear and give myself the permission to be human. So time off is important too, and of course exercise and meditation. In terms of what parents can do, I do want to go back to Dan's first point about control. Create rituals, create habits around things that you think will contribute to your well-being, to your kids' well-being. And that could be sitting together around the dinner table. And if your kids don't want to be there, they need to be there. They don't need to talk, but they need to be there. They need to exercise. They can't be on the screen all day. You know, Rami Harpaz, who was a prisoner of war in Egypt, was in a tiny prison cell. He was really quarantined in isolation. And he says that the thing that kept him sane during all those years in prison was that he exercised. And the way he exercised, he walked around that prison cell in a figure of 600 times. So if he could exercise daily and regularly, so can we, and so can our kids, even if we can only leave our homes for 500 meters or 100 meters.
All right, Dan, final words and thoughts for our parents viewing right now?
So for parents, you know, I think that one of the things that this time allows us to do is to pick a large project to do with our kids. And, you know, school, if you outside of project-based learning, school is usually piecemeal lots of different things. This is an opportunity to do something on a big scale. Do a project on Alaska or global warming or viruses or whatever it is. Get the kid to pick something that they want and use the time to attack it from all angles. And I think having something like this that is going to be with us for a year will create sufficient flexibility and interest and joy that can also unite the family. What are you learning? Something big and interesting. In terms of personal happiness, I think there are two types of happiness. Happiness 1 and happiness 2. Happiness 1 is sitting on the beach drinking mojito or beer. Happiness 2 is getting a feeling of contribution, meaning, accomplishment, and so on. Since COVID started, I have very little happiness 1 and lots of happiness 2. I am looking forward to 2021 when maybe there'll be some more happiness 1 as well.
Tal, final words. Do you also think that it's time for happiness 2 and you're waiting for 2021?
Yeah, fortunately, as Dan alluded to, there are many levels of happiness. There is pleasure, there is meaning, there is intellectual well-being, learning, there is interpersonal well-being, and we can explore the different facets of happiness, even if pleasure is not in an all-time high, to put it mildly.
All right. Well, we'll wait for 2021 and practice everything you said until then. Tal Ben-Shahar, Dan Ariely, an absolute pleasure speaking to you both today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Any thoughts?